Hey everyone, in this lesson we're going to be going over some of the basic render settings you'll find in Arnold. So we're going to first just jump into the render settings up here. It's right next to the render options, and we're going to go into this first common tab. So this common tab is actually going to be something, if you've used something like V-Ray or Mental Ray, it's going to be very familiar to you. Up at the top we have our file output options. By default we already have EXR, which is pretty much the standard and the basic, the default for the industry. So I pretty much get used to using an EXR format, and then we have a couple different compression formats on here. There is some thoughts that zips might be a little faster in Nuke besides zip, but I personally just use zip most of the time. I don't think it's going to be that big of a thing unless you're getting into something like deep rendering and stuff like that. So don't worry too much about this at this point in your career. This part right here, this is half precision. Rather than saving a 32-bit EXR, it'll save a 16-bit. This is really, personally, it's good enough for most things, unless you have a tech pass where you want to get some extra nice data passes, like say a normals pass, and you want to have a high fidelity on that. You can turn that off for that particular render layer, but I usually will just click that on by default. It can help speed up Nuke quite a bit. Preserve layer name and tiled, I don't necessarily use these all that much. I do use auto crop, which will essentially put a bounding box around where the useful render information is, and that'll help speed up in Nuke as well. Append, I don't use that either. There is, below this we have our frame animation extension. So this is basically, it's gonna say how you wanna name your files as they're rendered. So this name.extension, that'll just be basically usually your scene name and then the extension that you choose. So for us it would be whatever the scene is called, and then actually calling it, I would just do .exr, so it wouldn't give us the frame number we're on. So I'll usually switch this to name.number.extension, and then you can give the amount of frame padding you want on that. Pretty useful. And then once you activate that name.number extension, it'll actually open up this frame range area for you. So in this, whatever the animation or how long your animation is, that's how long you'd want to make your frame range. I don't necessarily, it's not super necessary for us to set this now because we're just doing stills and we're doing some settings, so I'm going to keep it right here at its default. And of course you can renumber these. If say you start on 1000 but you actually want to bring it into Nuke on 1 for whatever reason, it's definitely available for you. Now below this, the frame ranges, we have our renderable camera. So this is where you're going to actually want to choose the camera that you want Arnold to render. So right now it's set to perspective because I don't necessarily have any other cameras in this scene, but if you have a animated camera or a tracked camera, you'd want to set that as your renderable camera. And then below that we have image size. I'm just doing 540 just to help do some tests, but you know, they have a lot of defaults in here, so you have an HD 1080 if you want to do that. If you're doing 1080p renders, it's perfect for you. I'm going to keep this at 540 for me myself. And then below that we have some scene assembly options and render options. I don't personally use these all that often myself, so wouldn't worry too much about them. But now let's actually jump into the Arnold renderer settings. So these settings, this is where we're going to be able to control just how noisy our image is. We're going to be able to control motion blur, how many bounces we're allowing in our scene, and a couple other extra things. So let's just jump in and just first start talking about sampling. So I'm going to set these values to 222 all across, and let's just render this scene we have. I'm going to be using the Arnold render view. I've noticed it's a little more stable in certain situations, some situations not. So, but for this particular example and how we're going to be looking at these different render settings that we have, I'm actually going to be using the Arnold render view just so we can look at some of the extra passes, and that way we can kind of see all of these different samples in their own little pass, and we're going to be able to tell how many extra samples we need to provide them. So something that I'm going to get into later in this series is how to add AOVs and how to use them inside of Nuke. But for now, I've actually gone in, I've added a couple of these AOVs. I used the AI standard ones, and I added some of the ones that I'll be looking at in this scene. So be aware of that. I will be having AOVs. You probably don't know exactly what that means. It's arbitrary output values or variables, I believe. So, but this is really helpful for us being able to break down our shader and being able to see where our noise is coming from. So I'm going to start up a render real quick and let's see what this gives us. So I'm going to be doing that actually by going to the Arnold tab and pressing render here. If you're having an older version of Arnold, you might just get an option that just says Arnold render view. In a newer version of Arnold, you no longer will automatically start a render if you click on this Arnold render view option now. But if you just press render, it'll automatically just start rendering away for us. And I'll be going over how we can actually install that new render or any version of new Arnold onto your Maya 2017 in a future video as well. So let's go ahead and start this up. Alright, so in this scene I have a rough refraction ball right here, and then I have an open-faced cube, and I have a subsurface, somewhat reflective little dragon here. So we're going to just be going through this kind of step by step and learning about how we can resolve some of these settings. But let's open up our render while this kind of cranks away, and we can start talking about what these different things are. So we have first camera or AA. So that's the anti-aliasing. So you're going to notice if I have a really low anti-aliasing, we'll start getting super jaggedy edges along these harsh edges right here, especially in lower resolutions. You'll notice it more. And the camera AA is kind of almost a multiplier of all these other ones. So it's basically how many base rays are you going to be sending out from your camera per pixel. So if I put a value of 2 in here, it's actually doubled. So if I put a value of 2 here, if you actually look up at the top, there's these little calculations of how many samples you're doing. So if I have a camera AA of 2, I'm actually putting out 4 samples per pixel. So it's I think it's essentially doubling for each time we have here. It's actually multiplying by itself. So if I have a 1 in here, it literally is just 1. If I have a 2, it'll give us 4, 3, 9, and so on. So I'm actually going to do these initial tests with a camera AA of 1, which is extreme. No one would ever actually render in these values, but what this is going to allow us to do is actually rather than focus on the multiplier of how this camera AA is working with these other parameters we have, we'll actually just be able to focus on just them, and we can actually look at how many samples each of these will give us right here. And so if I have a value of, say, this diffuse right here of 2, and I have AA of 1, we're getting 4. So it's essentially doubling what we have here. I think it's actually an exponential equation. So if I actually bring this to, say, a 2, value of 2, we're going to go from 4 diffuse samples to 16. So it's quadrupling, not quadrupling, but it's essentially compounding like faster and faster as we raise up in our AAs. So in these first initial tests, you're going to see me putting in some pretty high numbers for these diffuse, glassy, and refraction samples. But as we start upping our camera AA, we'll be able to actually drastically reduce these diffuse amounts or glossy amounts, and so that we can fall in line and have noise, well, somewhat noise-free renders, but also being able to not actually just arbitrarily put in numbers here real quick. So we'll have, we'll be able to conserve render time as much as we can. You're always going to have a little noise in Arnold, unfortunately. There are some tricks in Nuke you can do to reduce some of that, but we're going to try to get there as least noisy as possible. So I'm going to leave this at 1, and we're going to first go over direct diffuse. So direct diffuse and direct specular. Those values are actually not really controlled within these parameters here, besides the camera AA. So the main thing you're going to be able to resolve direct diffuse and indirect, or direct specular and direct diffuse is with camera AA and light samples. So I'll be going over light samples a little bit in the next video, but I'm actually just going to click on some of these lights, go into their attribute editor, And if I scroll down, we have a sample section here. Now, these are going to be similar values to kind of what you're going to want to put into your glossy and diffuse based on what you have here. But I'd say a general rule of thumb is if you're around 2 or 3 AAs or samples within these lights, you're most likely going to be in a pretty good place for your direct and direct diffuse and specular. So they're going to play similar to how these other ones will. So we're not going to really focus too much on these direct diffuse and speculars all too much, but rather we're going to focus on our indirect diffuse, specular, and overall subsurface scattering and refraction. So I'm going to just click on our indirect diffuse here real quick. And this is a pretty noisy render, which is somewhat understandable with the settings that we have here. But we're going to try to just resolve these a little bit. So let's see here. That's a little too large for us. Okay, so a good thing if you're going to be going in and trying to reduce these samples is to actually focus in on a small area, because it can get pretty expensive if you're just putting all these values in and waiting for your whole image to resolve. So within the render view here, I'm going to press this play button, and that's going to give us kind of an IPR type render, so we can kind of watch it resolve over time. So I think I saved it. Cool. We have this snapshot saved, so we can start trying to resolve this now. So I'm going to start upping these diffuse values. So if I put in, say, a value of 5, let's see what this resolves to us for. All right. So we're already seeing a decent amount of reduced noise between these two, but it's still fairly noisy. And this is one of your passes that will actually be pretty noisy from time to time. So, but if you look here, we have our diffuse samples. We're only at 25. So it's not a very extreme amount. So I'm going to actually say from some tests before, I was actually able to go pretty high on this. I think almost around 12 diffuse samples here. So let's throw that in here. We're getting 144 diffuse samples now. Not too much either. In the grand scheme of how large these samples can get, because we have this one AA, it's not too bad. Alright, so that's a pretty drastic difference, I would say. It's not perfect, so I may consider going up to, say, a value of 14. And let's see what that gives us. There will be some pauses within this video as we wait for the resolutions, by the way. Alright, I'd say that's pretty decent for what we're going for. Alright, so I'm going to remember this value here. We have a value of 196. So I'm actually just going to open up a notepad real quick, just so I can put those values in here. There are some decent scripts and stuff like that that will actually help you resolve this information. So I'm going to just say diffuse samples, and those are 196. Alright, so I'm going to actually shoot this back down to 0, because we don't need to, we've got a decent amount of direct diffuse values that we want, or indirect diffuse values. So now we got our glossy samples here. These are fairly noisy as well, so we can start upping these. So let's just slowly get on here. Let's put a value of, say, 6 in here. And I mean, that's not super noisy, but it's definitely still there. You can definitely see some noising and some banding. So I'm gonna actually start upping this even more. And from some tests before that I did, I noticed that around a value of 10 was pretty decent for this. Alright, I'd say that's pretty decent on its noise level. Okay, so now we can actually move on to our refraction samples here. So I'm going to go to our refraction pass here, and if you look here, I have a little dome just right here. Alright, So this is a rough refraction. So it's actually going to need a decent amount of samples to be pretty noise free. Refraction is not a very cheap thing inside of Arnold here. You see here, this is quite noisy. So I'm going to save a snapshot of this guy, and we can start up in those values as well. Let's try 6 again. And you can of course go back and look at your beauty paths on here. I'm switching between these AOVs by using the Arnold render view and going into these extra AOVs that I added. So I'm just going to go to the refraction pass, and you know, that's still kind of noisy. So it's not exactly what I'm wanting here. So, you know, as before, I actually did some tests on this, and I found around a value of 10. I could probably go up to, say, maybe 12, something like that, and we could get into a good space. But just because of how expensive refraction can be in Arnold, I'm gonna veer away from that, to be honest. Alright, so I'm looking at these ones that are already resolved and comparing that with this original one of just a value of 2. That is extremely resolved. So I think that's actually a pretty decent number. And I didn't save that last glossy value that we had. So I'm actually going to stop this render real quick. But if I look here, the refraction samples are a value of 10, because right now, since it's 1, they're just going to multiply against themselves. So it's 10 times 10 is how many refraction samples we're getting. So that would be a refraction sample value of 100. So I'm going to put a refraction samples, that's 100. And if you remember, we had the glossy set to 10 as well, so that would mean its glossy sample was at 100 as well. Alright, so those are decent values we got here. Now the last thing we really want to resolve here, if we look at this image, is this guy right here. We have a subsurface little dragon here, and it is quite noisy. So let's start getting into this. And I'm actually going to turn my diffuse and my glossy values back up to 1 at least. But I will be focusing on just the subsurface of this value here. So this rendered fairly quickly, but as you can tell, it is quite noisy. So let's start going into our SSS pass here. We do have this indirect and direct subsurface scattering. This is pretty new to Arnold. I haven't actually seen it before some of these newer versions. I believe that the direct SS will probably be somewhat affected by your light samples as well. But your overall SSS values here are going to affect it as well. So I'm going to just focus on just this SS pass and not the split out versions of the two. So I saved that thumbnail so we can compare them. And let's put, say, a value of 6 here. So the thing is with these subsurface scattering values, I don't believe they're multiplied. They might be somewhat multiplied by your camera AA, but you're not actually going to get those same calculations that we're getting up here. So they will, I think they are factored into your camera AA, but unfortunately we don't get to see them within here. So with a value of 6, it's a pretty big difference here. You know, it's resolved quite a bit, but not quite enough. We're still seeing a decent amount of noise in here. So let's say, let's put a value of 10. It's kind of a common thing today, I guess. Take a little bit to resolve on these. Alright, now seeing these values between these two, yeah, that is quite a difference, with especially the ones that are resolved here. And you know, there's a little noise in here, but it's really not too much. It's probably something we could reduce with maybe a little softening inside of Nuke. So I think we're in a decent space for all these values. This last option you're going to see here is volume indirect. So that's for if you have a volume pass in there and how many It's essentially how many extra samples you're going to get within your indirect of your volume. I don't have any volumes in this particular setting, but if you follow these same basic rules of looking and seeing how your volume pass is noise-wise compared to the other ones, you can relatively just up that rather than upping your AA on everything. That's the whole point of this situation where I'm individually going through all these different passes, is just so that you can resolve your render in a much faster way, and you don't have to waste your time sampling something that's already pretty clean. So now we can get into, as I like to call, the magic. And we're gonna shoot for getting these values. I'm gonna put them all back to 1. You know, if we look at this, it's gonna be noisy beyond belief. But we can start looking at these values we've set here. So we have a diffuse sample of 196 and a glossy samples of 100, and refraction is the same. So I'm going to just put in a value that I know is somewhat decent. And that's another thing with your camera AA. It is the direct diffuse and stuff like that with your light samples, but it also has to affect things like motion blur or depth of field. So if you're putting in motion blur in your renders right inside of Arnold, if you're getting noise just because of that and you're not noticing any extra resolution from getting these set up, you're going to want to go higher and higher on your camera AA samples. So as you go higher up on your camera AAs, you won't need as many of your diffuse or glossy. So be aware of that. Try to balance these out as things go on. But I'd say a value of 5 is pretty decent. Arnold kind of suggests on their website, you know, for medium level renders you get a 4, really high quality samples at an 8, and if you got to go real extreme, you can get even higher. But I've noticed that you can kind of hit a sweet spot, especially depending on your motion blur you have in your objects. You know, a lot of my render settings at an end of a project will vary from 8 to 10 AAs, sometimes longer if it's a fast moving car, so be aware of that. So I'm going to put a value of camera AA of 5 here. So that's put everything, especially when they're all set to 1, at a value of 25. So we actually want to get our diffuse value somewhere closer to a value of 196 for it to be resolved. So I'm going to start upping these. So if we put in 3 here, we're getting 225. It's pretty close. And if we put a value of 2, we're getting 100. So I would say a value of 3 is the closest we're going to get to that 196 in this current camera AA settings. Now we have the glossy. So if we put a value of 2 in here, it'll go from 25 and it'll go to 100. So that's actually the value we have set here. And then the same thing for the refraction. I'm going to set that to 2, and we'll get a value of 100. So as you saw earlier, you know, we had those really extreme values inside of these, but as we up these AAs, we can really bring those values back down, and it won't be so crazy in those because the camera A will be doing that multiplication for us. So I'm actually going to say, let's set off this render and let's just see how noisy or how noise free it is. So I'm going to pause this video as soon as I send off the render, and we'll check in a couple minutes. All right, let's run this IPR. And let's see the whole scene, eh? I'll be right back. All right, we're back, and now this is finally rendered here, guys. So looking at it, you might have actually noticed when I did send off that render, I didn't have my subsurface scattering up a little bit. So I brought that back up to actually around 3. And now that we've done that, we've actually gotten fairly decent. I mean, there still is a little noise in here and stuff like that. This could probably be pretty resolved with a little softening inside a Nuke. But compared to where we started, this is a huge boost. So, you know, this is just take this information to heart. You know, when you're doing your final renders and you're setting stuff up, don't just willy-nilly just throw in some samples. You know, I've been known to do that myself. And I mean, you could theoretically just put in, say, 622 or 822, and you're going to get a pretty noise-free render. But if you want to be a little more informed about how you're getting your renders done and making sure you're using your resources as well as you can, this is the way to do it. But I'll see you guys in the next round, and we'll go over a couple more of these things. So I'll see you guys real soon.